The title of my talk is Why Do Rural Chinese Continue to Do Migrant Work? And I like to thank the team that I belong to, without whom any of this research would not have been possible. And this team, the vision started with the late Professor Bai Nanseng at Renmin University. And the other team members include Professor Wang Yu of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Professor Chen Chuanbo of Renmin University, Professor Chen Chen, who at Shanghai University, also a former PhD student of mine, and especially all the people who allowed us to go into their home in rural China to share their stories and share their thoughts with us. And I'd also like to acknowledge the UCLA Office of the Chancellor for research support. Dodo talked about the fact that I am an alumna of UCLA, I'm an alumna of Hong Kong U, but there's actually a lot of lineage between Hong Kong U and UCLA. One of my current PhD students graduated from Hong Kong U 2 years ago, Department of Geography. And I believe that UCLA probably sent at least a couple of fresh PhD students to the Department of Geography at UCLA, including one currently, I believe. Okay, so let's keep the lineage going. Okay, let's do even more exchange in the future. Okay, actually, so the picture shown here, it's from an article published in New York Times about a year ago. And as you can see, it shows somebody moving from the countryside to the city to work as a migrant worker. In the same article, there are two other pictures shown. The one on the right, lighting is not the best, but you can kind of see that people were carrying big bags with them. And this is one of the railroad stations, and people do that, right, during Spring Festival. And the picture on the left shows people waiting for work in the streets. And the title of that article is The New World. They propelled China's rise. Now they have nothing to fall back on. And they, in this case, refers to the migrant workers. And this is quite typical how migrant workers are being portrayed, especially in the Western media, that they are marginalized, disadvantaged, vulnerable, and taken advantage of. All of this is true. Okay. If that is true, why do they keep coming back to the city? Are they coming back to the city all the time and increasingly so? Well, these numbers seem to say so, okay? So China's level of urbanization increased tremendously. Right now, the level is more than 66%. And the last two censuses show that the floating population had increased continuously, probably actually accelerated in terms of increase. So in 2020, the floating population was 376 million, accounting for 26% of the country's population, of whom 286 million of them were rural migrants. Okay, so about 3/4 of the floating population, and the vast majority of the rural migrants went to work in urban areas, so rural-urban migrants. So these numbers seem to suggest that yes, rural Chinese continue to be pursuing migrant work. And there are a lot of sacrifices, right? This famous documentary, Last Train Home, I think that was done more than 15 years ago, okay, show a household being split because of migrant work. The bottom photo here is by a photographer who went to different parts of China and showed these empty chairs that would have been filled if it were not for migrant work. And then the top right photo is by one of the pictures I took in rural China showing grandparents left behind, grandmothers left behind, taking care of grandchildren. So split household is a thing. There's no question that it happens because of migrant work. And China's CDC had also shown data on the left, the age pyramid on the left is about rural China, and the one on the right is about urban China. So the one on the left clearly showed a hollowing out of rural Chinese, okay, that the young adults, working age adults have all left, leaving behind the old and the young. So who are the old and the young? So this is a household that we visited in July of this year in Sichuan. The grandmother just coming back from the field to be interviewed by us. And in front of her are rice fields, and behind her are cornfields. And the granddaughter is studying in the house. And I have a forthcoming paper in a editor book, and the book's editor really liked the story about this household, and she encouraged me to start my chapter by a conversation that we had in that household. Okay, and here's the conversation. 11-year-old Jaja, the young girl, glances at her grandmother before responding to the question. Do you want to join your brother in the city? She nods without vocalizing a yes. Her 70-year-old grandmother, who takes care of the family's corn and rice fields, explains. Jaja's parents work in Chongqing, where their older son goes to junior high. The parents want Jaja to stay in the village with me. So there's a lot behind this, okay? First of all, split household. Second of all, who gets to go to the city and stay with the parents and get educated in the city, okay? So obviously, Jaja wants to go, but as you can see from many places in rural China, when you have two children more, and if one is a son and the other one is a girl, they have to compete for resources. And a lot of times it's the son who gets picked for the resources in the home. So there are a lot of sacrifices, but the other sort of perspective here is that data seem to have shown that over the last several decades, rural Chinese are doing better economically. They've been doing better. So the top left shows some major findings by the State Council, as you can tell from the headline, okay, that Chinese rural residents have improved their disposable income by more than 40 times over the past 70 years. And the graph on the bottom right showed the relative situation, okay, how its urban income or rural income doing relative to urban income. So this is the ratio of urban to rural income. Okay, the higher it is, the wider the gap between urban and rural. So there's been fluctuating over time, and the peak of that ratio was reached in 2010s and in 2000s, then the beginning of 2010s. Okay, and then since the beginning of 2010s, actually that curve has been declining, meaning that the gap has been narrowing over time, meaning that rural Chinese are doing better, okay, over time, okay, relative to urban income. Okay. So first, there's so many sacrifices. Second, rural migrants are leading, a pretty miserable life in most cases. Third, the rural income is improving over time, okay? With all these changes, why is it that rural Chinese continue to do migrant work? We're talking about 4 decades of migrant work, okay? Do migration theories help us to explain this? Well, let's take a look at that. So the list here is probably pretty typical in a population class, population geography class, or migration class, in which you talk about what are the theories of migration, okay? So push-pull, something you don't like in the origin, something you like in the destination, okay? Ravenstein's laws of migration, including one of the major observations being that economic incentive is the major motivation for migration. Everett Lee talked about What are the pluses and minuses in the origin? What are the pluses and minuses in destination? What are the obstacles in between? And the personal factors such as, are you able to move? Gravity model aims to predict the volume of migration or flows between one place and another, right? Neoclassical economics considers migration a tool and a mechanism to equalize wages and to equalize labor supply and demand. The next three take our perspective more to the individual and household levels. So behavioral view focuses on perceived utility of potential migrants and the stress that's built up when you really, really don't like where you are, okay? Life cycle, life course perspective, consider the household, consider one's stage of life and also consider the household stage of life, okay? New economics of labor migration focuses on remittances and the relationship between the migrants and the left behind. So the last three are somewhat closer to, take us a bit closer to where things are in terms of Chinese rural urban migrants. That said, almost everything listed here assumes that migration means a change in residence, if not permanent change in residence. Okay, that's this assumption that this is what we mean by migration. And I would argue that we also need a household approach. We also need to consider migration as more than just a person coming from one place to another. We also need to consider how the household sort of behaves. And so this idea of householding, how members of a household keep the household intact and move the household along, right? So this is a process, a verb. Household can be a verb. And many of the rural urban migrants in China are not necessarily just migrating from one place to another, but they're actually circulating. One can argue that they have they're multi-local. One can also argue that they're translocal. And many migrants of the world, international migrants, are like that too. Okay, not necessarily just going from point A and point B, but they're circulating. And members of the household are also linked. Their lives are linked. And this is also an important way of thinking about this. Okay, so I'm beginning, I'm increasingly attracted by the approach called livelihood approach. And livelihood is about how people create their living. And this is very much centered on people. Okay? And livelihood approach asks three questions: resources, strategies, and outcomes. First question, what resources do people have? Second question, what strategies do they use, or what do they do? Third question, what are the outcomes of their activities? And that is, what are the goals that they're pursuing? Okay, so think about those three questions. And I've listed some authors here who've been advancing this approach, and they also advocate very much for individual and household level observations and analysis. And the literature of livelihood approach tends to address these topics: development, poverty, sustainable living, and survival strategies. And they also tend to really take seriously the role of gender and the role of generations. But one of the critiques we have about this literature is that the attention to cultural and contextual factors seems to be somewhat insufficient. And I think to really explain the Chinese situation, the rural Chinese situation, one really has to take seriously customs, norms, identities, because these things give meaning to their endeavors. Okay. So asking those three questions to rural Chinese: what resources do they have? Well, their farmland is kind of limited, but they do have labor, okay? And they're willing to be mobile. They're willing to move around, and that is an asset. That is an asset, that is a resource. What strategies have they pursued? obviously migrant work, but also flexibility, meaning what kind of work do? They grew up being farmer, maybe, but they can be working in factories, they can be working in construction sites, they can be street sweepers, they can be anything, very flexible. Where? They can be moving around from one city to another. They can stay in the city for a little bit and come back for a little bit and build a house and go back out. It could be that they come back and someone else goes out. Okay, so there's all kinds of permutations. They're willing to split the household as a means, not as an end in itself, but as a means in order to allow flexibility to take place. And there's a lot of collaboration and divisions of labor in the household between the husband and the wife, between the parents and the children, and who comes back to provide caregiving, for example, when there's need. Right? There's lots of flexibility, and that's part of their strategies. What are the outcomes they're trying to pursue? What are the goals? Obviously, income, okay? And that's immediate, put food on the table. But also savings, because you need savings in order to support and fund more long-term household projects, okay? So, and what are the income and savings for? And this is the gist of a lot of the questions that we've been asking in our interviews. Is what are they using the remittances for? As I mentioned, if you're poor, then the first thing to do is to put food on the table, right? And after a little bit, you would think about, hey, can I maybe get a TV? Okay. Improve living standard. And then maybe I can actually put my children to school, okay. Children's education. For farmers, maybe you wanted to invest in farming, okay. But the last two, the house, building the house, and supporting son's marriage are somewhat unique for rural China, okay. And of course, supporting son's marriage has a lot to do with the one-child policy, has a lot to do with the fact that, especially in rural areas, the sex ratio imbalance is pretty severe. Well, rather than hearing me talk about these things, let's hear from the rural Chinese themselves. Let's hear their voices and let's hear the story. So the project that I draw the observations from started in 1995, okay, by the team. And I joined this project 10 years later in 2005. And the project had to do with 300 rural households in 12 villages in 2 provinces that sent out a lot of migrants, Anhui and Sichuan. So the idea originally was that every 10 years we'd go back and interview the same 300 households. It's getting harder and harder because many of these households have left the countryside, and it's harder and harder to track them down. But we are still able to track down quite a significant number of households. As I mentioned, the last time we were in the countryside was July 2024. So I will share 4 stories from 4 households from that visit and previous visits. And I call these longitudinal stories because the interesting thing is that every time we go back, we ask pretty much similar questions with some changes. And then, but when they told us what happened in the 1980s and the 1990s, every time it's a little different. Every time they tell you a little bit more. And also, they will include also reflections, okay, evaluations, and even emotions. And so that's, I think, the beauty of longitudinal stories is not just about facts, it's also about how they feel about the decisions that they made. Okay, so I'm going to show a number of quotes, and I'll read the quotes to you. And the orange numbers here refer to the period of time that they talked about. Okay, and the bottom, the green letters and numbers indicate when that interview took place. Okay, so in this case, the interview took place in 1995, and the interviewee was talking about what happened in the 1980s. Okay. So I began migrant work in 1983. I was 19 years old. My brother was young, and my sister was disabled. It was a heavy burden on my parents, so I decided to go out to make money. Pretty straightforward. Poverty, subsistence, no other options, right? Same person, 10 years later, told us what the money was for. From 1993 to 1994, I earned more than 20,000 yuan from migrant work. I had thought it was enough to build a house, but I didn't expect the cost of building materials to rise so much. Cement rose from 280 yuan per ton to 320 yuan. Stones rose from 37 yuan per square to 45 yuan. And lime rose from 80 yuan to 100 yuan a ton. So it's really very, to me, impressive that they can tell you all these details, and all these details really mean a lot to them. Okay? The house cost nearly 20,000 yuan, and I owed more than 7,000 yuan in debt. I still plan to go on next year. You can't make money at home. So paying off debt is another reason. It's not just subsistence, right? And because there was a lack of savings, so every time you need to do something, a major project like a house, you end up borrowing money from people, and you have to pay off the debt, and as a result, you need to go out to work. Another reason for paying off debt is having children. Okay. So also in the about the 1990s, but just see, when this person was interviewed in 1995, they didn't talk about that. But in 2011, they talked about the fine due to the violation of the one-child policy. And as you know, if the first child is a son, you're not supposed to have a second child in rural China. Okay, if the first is a daughter, yeah, maybe you can get by. But if the first is a son, you can't have another one. So, I think this household is actually pretty progressive. They want to have another one, and you see the reason why. After giving birth to a son, we had a daughter, and we're fined 1,500 yuan for the second child. Why second child? Well, most parents have 2 children, and we wanted to have a second child despite the fine, because the elderly's burden on a single child would be too heavy. Unlike urban residents, rural people are not protected by the government. The government will not care for older people in the countryside. This person was talking about this in 2011, more than 10 years before, and they already realized that the burden on the single children is too much, right? So, but of course, the termination of one-child policy happened later than that. Okay, 10 years later, they are improving the living condition, the living standard. Okay, in the past few years, I've been working as a construction contractor in Suzhou. In 2001, we purchased a major appliance, a 29-inch color TV, which cost more than 2,000 yuan. So things are happening at the house. They can actually purchase appliances. 10 years later, 2010s, what's the concern at that time? Our son has reached marriageable age, but he won't be able to find a wife unless we have a new house. And the funny thing is that in rural China, when you're doing interviews, you're not just interviewing one person or 2 people of the household. All the neighbors came. All the neighbors came, and they want to chime in. It was so the neighbors who joined the conversation agreed that no woman will agree to get married if the husband does not have a new house. So it's not just one person's opinion; it's a collective understanding. Okay. So this is a picture. It's not the same picture as that household, but this is a picture that shows how an interview looks like. And this is actually a household with means, so you can tell, it's the floor and everything is well decorated. But we were interviewing somebody, and everybody came, and you are not sitting on the chair like that. You're sitting on a little stool, and then very close to the ground. Okay, so this is what an old house looked like. Okay, no woman would marry into a household with that kind of a house. This is what a new house looked like in the village. Here's another view of a new house. So this is what in the 2010s women expect to see in rural areas. And I said 2010s because things are different now. Okay. So they did build a new house in 2011. Our old house has only 2 rooms, but there were not enough space for additional family members. So building a new house was for the purpose of my son's getting married. My son got married in 2012 after we built a house. The second floor is for the son and daughter-in-law with a separate kitchen. The house was built with the money from migrant work by the two of us and our son and daughter. So this is a collective effort, okay? The two parents, the son and daughter all went out to work in order to accrue the savings to support the building of a house or renovation of a house in order for the son to get married, okay? That's the floor that I was talking about. This is the actual house of this household, okay? Pretty nice, okay? So that's the second floor. You can see the living room, you can see the dining room. On the left is the entrance to the two bedrooms, okay? So in a sense, it's kind of a success story in the sense that the goals were met, okay? Second story or second household. Here we start in the 1990s, and the interviewer said, this year I earned more than 1,800 yuan. I spent 1,000 yuan and sent back 800 yuan. The money sent back was mainly for the child's school fees. We don't have any savings. If we did, I would not go out. So remember, this is before, I think, 2006 when the 9-year education started. So we're still, prior to that, and even after that, I think rural Chinese still had to spend money to send their children to school. And it's not inexpensive, okay? And then what's their plan, okay? When I have more money, I would like to improve our housing condition. And now we have 4 rooms in the Earth House. We have 2 big rooms and 2 small rooms. The 2 big rooms were brought from the older brother, costing 500 yuan. At that time, our 2 children were still in school, and the money was borrowed from several relatives, and it was paid off after 2 or 3 years. So again, sending 2 children to school, it's going to cost money, and you have to kind of wait for that to finish before you can have any savings to do projects such as building a house. 10 years later, 2000s. This is all Chinese, so I'm going to show the next one, which is English. And bear with me, it's a little long, but the details actually matter. So this is actually the wife talking. While working in Fujian, my husband heard that our house had collapsed. So the old houses tend to be not very well built. And so if nobody's taking care of them, they can actually fall apart. Okay. So he returned in August to repair it. Because no one was there to take care of the house, it could fall apart even more. So the 4 people in the household were all working in Fujian, and this is how they live. During that time, our family of 4 rented a room together, spent 1,000 yuan a month on rent and food. The 2 children gave us steady income, about 1,000 yuan a month. And after food and rent, the whole family could save more than 900 yuan a month. And so the whole year, they could save 8,000 to 10,000 yuan a year. My husband said that this would be good if it was like this every year, and we would not need more. This is enough. The house could be renovated for 40,000 yuan, and at the current rate of saving, after 2 more years, we will be able to save enough money to return by 2006, and we will have a new house in 2008. And our children can continue to work outside and keep their earnings themselves. And when we get old, we will return home to farm. My husband can also do some weaving, and we will have enough to live on. So this is a very contented family, okay? They're going out to work, and they have a plan to save. And then they're doing their math and say, if we continue to have this kind of savings for a few years, we will have a new house. We don't have to go and work anymore, and we can come back. So we're contented with intention to return. Okay, remember, they thought that the house would be renovated for 40,000 yuan. They thought. And then, and they did build a house. And they said that we only have 20,000 yuan in savings, and the rest of the money was actually borrowed, so they need more than 20,000 yuan. After building the house, they have to go out to work again to repay the debt, And so my son and daughter worked for 3 years to pay off the debt. How much do you think the house costs in the end? Not 40. It cost 90,000 yuan, okay? So later, they said that, well, it actually costs more than 90,000 yuan to build a house, and at present, it will not even sell for 50,000 yuan. So first of all, they were in serious debt because they only had 20,000 yuan, so they had to borrow 7,000 yuan. And when interviewed in 2014, their reflection was that we spent 90,000 yuan on the house. And now by 2014, if we want to sell it, it won't even sell for 50,000 yuan. But I would not sell it, even if I have a house in town, because it's not convenient for farming. So they're still thinking about farming. So, remember the migration series talking about economic motive? This is certainly not good business. You spend 90,000 yuan and you can't even sell the house for 50,000 yuan, right? So building a house, is it for economic benefits? I don't think so. After a little bit, they changed their mind and said that, well, actually, I really want to buy a house in the town, okay, or even the county seat. Because even though our finances are limited and we really can't afford it, the reason for buying a house is for the son's marriage. Because women nowadays have high expectations. They want the husband's family to have a house in the town, preferably in the county seat. So again, building a house in a village is really not a good deal. First of all, you actually lose money. Second of all, things are changing over time, right? Initially, a village house was attractive to a potential daughter-in-law, not anymore. Now it will have to be a house in a town or county seat. Not only that, the son is not getting married. So my son is 40 years old and is still single, not married, no house, no car. Now the bride price is as high as 120,000 yuan. And if it were 60,000 or 80,000 yuan, that's considered cheap. This was the most recent interview, okay? When interviews during the 2010s, very few people talked about bride price. They talked about house. Now they talk about bride price more. So the equations are changing. The expectations are changing, okay? Third household, about education. We did not return during the Spring Festival. We sent home 500 or 600 yuan every month. The biggest expense in recent years is children's schooling. Again, sort of somewhat unexpectedly, but that's actually a big budget item. Middle school costs more than 1,000 yuan a year, including lodging and food. My son already chooses the cheapest food in the school. For 6 yuan a day, you can only get vegetables. Anything with meat costs at least 2.5 yuan. Our younger children is in primary school costing 300 yuan a year, but next year he will go to junior high, which will cost even more. So when you have children in school in the 2000s, you can't afford to do anything else. 10 years later, I have never thought about staying in Dongguan for good. I just want to make some money. My plan is to wait for the children to finish school and then go home to take care of the elderly. So a little bit similar to the person of the household before. The intention is to go back home, okay? And what about housing, okay? 10 years later, the old house was very run down and about to collapse, and it was on a hill, making it very inconvenient to get to town. Before, I couldn't save much because the 2 sons were in school. Around 2017, I bought my current home in the town using the money from 4 people's migrant work, myself, my wife, and my sons. Again, very similar, collective collaboration. The home cost around 120,000 to 130,000 yuan at that time, about 90 square meters on the first floor, which is convenient for the elderly. But after finishing college in Chengdu, my younger son stayed there to work. In 2023, he bought a house in Chengdu and got married in the same year, so not returning to the village or to the town. The bride price was 50,000 yuan, which is not high. Again, some other people pay more. So they start talking about, bride price, talking about son's marriage, not so much about the house anymore, okay? So the meanings have changed. What is meaningful to people have changed. This is from the most recent interview. So the younger son has gotten married. But the older son is still not married, and this is the source of frustration. Okay? Women nowadays have high demands for the husband. I want a house, a car, but my older son's salary is not enough. Every year, my little son came back for 6 or 7 days during the Spring Festival, and we'll arrange for him to xiangqing or to matchmake. But where do you find a woman to date? Females are so few in number. That's why we use matchmakers who charge 200 yuan just for introductions, whether they're successful or not. But spending money doesn't mean that you will be successful, okay? So that's a source of frustration. Again, this is an interview only recently. Last household. This is kind of funny. So they talked about in the 1990s, there are 4 people in the family. They also decided to have another child after the first son. And because the second son, it's over policy, or in Chinese, 超生, okay. And they actually name him something 超, meaning 超生. And of course, the word Chinese character 超 could mean superior, advanced, and actually there's a famous person in Hong Kong with that name, and that is your chief executive. But I thought that the parents are really funny to call the younger son something Chao. Okay, so the family has 2.1 acres of land, 0.7 acres of land per person. So there are 4 people. Okay, but 7 times 4 should be 2.8 and not 2.1. It's only 2.1 because the extra child is not allocated any land. So you can be fined for having a second child, and also at the same time, the other penalty is that they don't get any provision in terms of land because it was over policy. Okay, and then with the money I earn, I want to build a house first, and then I'll earn more money and come back and find something to do. Again, at least in the 1990s, 2000, people are still talking about coming back to farm or do something else. In 1997, the house was built. It's a 2-story building with 4 rooms, brick and wood structure, and it costs 50,000 to 60,000 yuan. I borrowed a small amount, and I've already paid it off. But the house is empty. The house is still empty, and there's no furniture. Nobody's living there. Okay. Our income is primarily from migrant work. This has been the case for the last decade. The most important expenditure is to build a house that nobody lives in. Okay, it's not part of their interview, but I fill out the rest of the sentence, is to build a house that nobody lives in. That's not the picture of that particular house, but it's pretty typical that you enter a village house and there's very little furniture. Okay, partly because, again, very few people live there or nobody lives there. In the 2000s, again, about the son's education. If our oldest son is admitted to college, then we will continue migrant work to help pay for his tuition. If he can't get in, then we'll plan to return soon because he'll be working, right? And we don't have to support him. We're not young anymore, and the children can go out to work. So again, the plan is to come back after supporting children. This interviewee kind of felt that they had to explain for why they built a house that nobody lives in. The motivation for building a house at that time was due to traditional view. The view being that we should live at home. Okay. At that time, 20,000 yuan also could get you 2 houses in the town, but they didn't do that. They built a house in the village. But I didn't even think of buying a house there, meaning in the town. I didn't expect that the 2 children would never come home to live. Okay? The house has been built for 10 to 20 years and no one lives there. Returning to farm with a little light work should be no problems for me, but it's up to my 2 sons to see how they do. It's up to them. They're going to get married, and I'm going to return if they do well, and I won't stay outside. Both of them now work in Chengdu, so that's more about their sons. Both sons work in Chengdu and have bought homes. The older son got married in 2019. The younger son is still single. He's just not getting married. We urge him often, but it's useless. We returned for the Spring Festival, and we arranged Xiangqing for him at least 3 times. He only stayed for a few days. We are anxious and have reminded him constantly, but it's useless. He said he's busy. So, kind of disgusted, feeling disgusted and frustrated that they try so hard. So I've shared with you some interviews of 4 households, and you can see some similarities, okay? So let me conclude. I think based on those stories and voices, I feel that when we talk about migrant work, it's not just about migration, okay? It's about how rural people household, again, I'm using as a verb, how rural people maintain their household using different kinds of strategies, and every decade, every now and then, you know, the goals are different, but those goals are meaningful to them. This is how they move the household along with them. Okay? And this is about how rural people create the living. This is how they create the living. This is not about migration. This is about their living. And how rural people derive meanings from their endeavors. The meaning is nothing to do with migrant work, it has to do with their perception and their notion about what a household should be like. Okay. And so I go back to the livelihood approach as I think a good approach to help us to understand all of this. There's a lot of, my talk here is really not that much about gender, but you can kind of see that there's a lot of gender ideology, norms, practices behind all of this. How husband and wife collaborate, how they divide up the labor in the home. I didn't go into too much about caregiving, but if I did, you'll see that is a very, of course, gendered kind of arrangement. But the marriage matchmaking stories that I've told here reinforces the fact that marriage continues to be transactional in China, particularly in rural China. And the house and the bride price are very important components in the marriage matchmaking process. And of course, underlying that is the one-child policy in the sex ratio imbalance. There's also a lot of intergenerational collaborations and responsibilities behind these stories that grandparents take care of the children left behind at home. And also in some cases, everybody goes out to work and accrue the savings to help the household to build a house. There's a lot of intergenerational responsibilities there. Parents feel that it's their responsibility for their sons to get married. Okay. So the investment in that process starts actually very young, when the boy is very young. So I think there's a lot of potential for research on what a home means, what a house means, what farmland means, what farming means. And in order to get to the bottom of all of that, is much more than economic rationalities, much more than economic explanations, okay? It has to be social, it has to be cultural, it has to deal with identity. And all these can't quite be explained by simply economic explanations. And finally, I think I find myself doing this plea, making this plea all the time now. And that is when we study urbanization, when we study urban China, when we study urban issues, we must include rural China and rural Chinese because they are part and parcel of the same whole. Thank you very much.